Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, cities are on wheels in this Peter Jackson produced adaptation of Philip Reeves' Mortal Engines.
Set a century after a devastating 60-minute war wiped out much of civilization, humanity has taken to mobile predator cities that devour smaller towns to scavenge their resources, with the biggest and most feared of all being London. On board London, Hester Shaw, played by Hera Hilmar, attempts to assassinate Thaddeus Valentine, played by Hugo Weaving, in revenge for killing her mother, but is thwarted by young historian Tom Natsworthy, played by Robert Sheehan, who finds himself kicked off of the city when Valentine tries to hide his crimes. Now Hester and Tom must try to survive the harsh hunting ground together, eventually teaming with the Anti-Traction League Resistance, led by G. Hayes and Anna Fang, to stop Valentine's evil secret weapon.
Mortal Engines is based on the book of the same name by Philip Reeve that was first published in 2001 and is the first in a 4-book series. Now Peter Jackson has had the film rights since 2009, but like so many things with Jackson, it got waylaid while he dealt with The Hobbit. So now that's finally out of the way, we now get this belated screen adaptation. Now Universal's marketing for this has been rather canny because they've placed Jackson at the forefront. You see him in the TV spots and promotional materials, personally introducing us to this movie. Welcome to the world of Mortal Engines. And one might get the mistaken impression that he actually directed it. Now, Jackson has a lot of involvement with this movie. It's made through his production company, he produced it, and he also co-wrote the screenplay, along with his regular writing team of Fran Walsh and Philippa Boyan, and together they wrote the Lord of the Rings trilogy together. In fact, a lot of people that worked on the Lord of the Rings films and the Hobbit films are also working on this movie, both in front and behind the camera, but he did not direct it. He actually deferred those duties to a long-time collaborator of his, Christian Rivers, who often works for him doing storyboards. The reason that Jackson explained is because of the intensity of the work on The Hobbit, he felt exhausted afterwards. He didn't want to take on a large-scale project, so he had another collaborator work on it. Jackson has directed another movie recently. He did They Shall Not Grow Old, the World War I restoration documentary. And so this movie is clearly trying to kick off a franchise, and I think that they've spent $100 million at least on the budget for this movie. So you can understand why they want to put Jackson at the forefront of it. It seems like they're very desperate to get people to go and see this movie, which is somewhat understandable when you see it, because it really does sputter on screen. I think I just have to come out here and say this. The premise of this movie is absolutely absurd. Even by the standards of big studio blockbusters like this one, the idea that in a post-apocalyptic future, humanity would regroup by building these huge roaming cities on wheels that are incredibly resource hungry and eating other smaller towns and cities, that's a really bizarre concept, and I think it takes a few moments to just get past your initial incredulity of it. I just think it's one of those things that's kind of lost in translation. I think it's one of those things where you read it in a book and you visualize it in your head and you don't really pay too much mind to it, but once you see it literally on screen, that's a whole different matter. It becomes very, very odd. But there is an appeal to the idea, and I think that's why Jackson liked it so much, because of the sheer spectacle and size of it. That's exactly what the medium works so well for. And I think you understand this in the opening section of this movie, the prologue of the film, where we're introduced to the enormous London chasing after this much tinier town, and it's trying to evade it all the while. There's something really great about that sequence in isolation. It would be a wonderful short. The idea is so kind of gonzo and off the wall that it does remind me a bit of Terry Gilliam, especially the short that he did that preceded Monty Python's The Meaning of Life, the Crimson Permanent Assurance, you know, with the building that becomes a pirate ship. It reminds me exactly of that, essentially, and that's pretty much the same kind of energy that's in the very earliest stages of this movie, and there's not really a focus on most of the characters in this early portion. You're just focusing on the sheer effects work. The problems really do start, however, when the actual movie kicks in. Of course, it's very easy to get on board with the premise once you realise that it's supposed to be a metaphor. It's a commentary on colonialism and imperialism and how Western cultures devour and subsume those smaller than them. I mean, for goodness sake, the villains of the movie are London with a huge Union Jack painted on their gaping maw. It doesn't get any less subtle than that, and yet the film seems totally uninterested in the allegorical side of its own concept. You would think they would be a little bit cheeky and playful with it, kind of nod to modern day politics with it, but they don't do that most of the time. In actual fact, they take the premise at face value. They treat it painfully literally, just using it as the basis for another post-apocalyptic adventure that we've seen so many versions of. And in doing so, it seems like the opportunities just sail past the filmmakers because either they decide to ignore that or just simply didn't recognise it in the first place. You can absolutely tell this is a movie that's made by someone that worked primarily in previs and storyboards because it's such a visual movie, and it's often quite arresting on that front. It feels like the kind of movie that would be a production designer's dream because you basically get to create a world, and I really loved everything to do with London on the design side of it. I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that I am English, I recognise a lot of it, and so you got landmarks incorporated like St. Paul's Cathedral, which plays a major role in the plot and eventually opens up to reveal a laser cannon inside of it. You've got this London Underground system inside of it, and there's definitely a social hierarchy on board. The more affluent members of society are on the upper decks, that's where a lot of the landmarks are, and then you get to the lower levels and it's a lot of people doing grinding industrial work. And I liked the process of dismantling and destroying towns because there's a chase sequence that goes on while this is happening, and it's essentially just huge chainsaws going at it, and they're diving out of the way until it's eventually chopped up and fed into the furnace. I mean, that is so just out there, and I wish the movie just embraced that side more often. But again, after the early stretch of the film, it so rarely has that kind of invention when it comes to any kind of its imagery. However, once we get outside of London, I find myself less enamoured with the visual look of it. As you would probably expect, this is a movie that very much leans on its steampunk aesthetic, which for me personally is very hit or miss, and a lot of the visuals of this movie are marked by either mud or rust. There's a lot of greys and browns where it's not being sickly green or dark blue in a lot of the night scenes, and when you combine all those things together, it all adds up to a look that just isn't very appealing or appetizing. It doesn't invite you to spend more time in this world. I found myself being pulled out of the film because of it. I genuinely found some sections of this movie to look ugly. Not in a cute way like you would normally expect with this kind of aesthetic. No, I mean in an ugly kind of way. Now that doesn't mean that I can't recognise invention in terms of the design work. Like the fact that there's a town that resembles a crawling bug, or the fact that there's a prison that resembles a giant spider, just to give you some Wild Wild West flashbacks. But so much of this movie just to me looked visually repellent, which is so unfortunate because you can clearly tell that so much has been spent on it on the production side in terms of set design and especially the CGI work, which is fantastic for the majority of the movie. And yet, it's all in service of something where the aesthetic is actually off-putting a lot of the time. While we're on that note, the script itself doesn't do the movie that many favours, especially in regards with its protagonist. When we first meet Hester Shaw at the beginning of the film, she's something of a mystery character. Her face is covered by a scarf. We don't know what her motivations are other than killing Valentine, and we won't know why until a great deal later. But the movie makes some pretty fundamental errors here, and the biggest one is that she's simply not a character that we want to spend more time with. There's nothing that gives the audience an opening to get on her side, especially in her first interactions with Tom in the hunting ground, because she treats him like dirt. She treats him with utter contempt. And I can understand what they're trying to do here, because she's meant to be someone that's quite tough and quite headstrong and actually surprisingly ruthless, but she's someone that's had to survive. She's had a very hard life in a lot of regards. The movie delays a lot of things that would make us more sympathetic towards her character and revealing her backstory for much later in the film. And by the time that it does eventually arrive, it's too late to care about both her or the story itself, and nothing about the way that the character is written in much of the first half of the movie or Hera Hilmar's performance invites us to want to learn more about her. And so that's a crucial stumbling block. But there's also the fact that because so much of the detail of her character is held back, there's this weird void. And what ends up happening in a very bizarre thing is that the villain of the movie starts looking like a protagonist because he has so much screen time. Hugo Weaving plays Valentine, who is very much the sort of higher class individual that uses their power and popularity to hide their true cruelty. And it's the kind of character that we've seen Weaving play in a lot of movies. It very much feels like a stock villain character, but I do like watching Weaving at work, even if this is very, very familiar for him. And in the first 40 minutes of this movie, he actually seems to dominate it. It seems to follow his character more than it does the supposed lead in Hester. Because it's so front-loaded with his character, it doesn't make you really know where the story is supposed to be aiming at. It feels like they've misjudged the balance here, and maybe they should have made a little bit more time with Hester as opposed to the antagonist of the movie and focusing on his machinations. You can tell this is a movie that embraced how big everything was, and that took precedence over everything else about it, even small things like characters, most of which are fairly two-dimensional and forgettable. Like you have Robert Sheehan, who is very much meant to be this sheltered city boy in the character of Tom. He hasn't known any other life outside of London, and now he needs to learn how to survive alongside the more experienced Hester. He's meant to be the audience surrogate character, essentially, and yet he's such a drip. The character is painfully whiny and naive to be around, and it doesn't help that Sheehan's performance could be best described as wobbly, especially with regards to his accent, which appears to be trying to fight its way out of his gob, and he doesn't appear to have very much chemistry with Hilmar, so that's two strikes right there. The only character that really makes much of an impression is Ji Han as Anna Fang, who really, for my money, is basically, hey, you know what we should do? We should just take Trinity from the Matrix and just plop them in the middle of this script. I mean, yeah, she stands out because suddenly she's this really violent, proactive character in the middle of this story, wearing a bright red coat. Of course you're going to stand out. But even so, she was the only character that I actually liked. But most of the other characters linger so little in the memory that even the film forgets about them. I'm pretty sure there's one character that just straight up disappears with no explanation, even though he's involved in a prominent subplot. I don't know how that happened, but that's symptomatic of the adaptation process, where you can plainly tell that there was far too much story in the book to condense into one film. Even though it's over 2 hours at 130 minutes, it still feels really, really rushed. Nothing really lands properly, especially not the emotional beats, especially because it gets into the rhythm of action scene, long expository flashback, action scene, flashback, and so on and so forth. It's the kind of movie where we're introduced to one location, but don't get too attached to it because it's blowing up in the next 5 minutes. Even on the post-production side, you can tell they were having trouble whittling this down. Look out for an early expository scene where they pretty obviously redubbed the entire dialogue. Almost none of the scene's lip sync matches whatsoever. Most of it is off camera, and what we do see is just, completely wrong with what he's actually saying. you can just tell that they were just trying to cut bits out to make it more manageable and more streamlined, and the film's so convoluted and has so many different characters and so many different environments that it simply would not allow them to do so. Like London in this film, what Mortal Engines is doing is basically taking other popular movies and scavenging them for parts. You definitely see elements of Snowpiercer, Howl's Moving Castle, there's a lot of Star Wars in here, but also the Terminator. Suddenly in the second act, it becomes a Terminator movie. Suddenly, this cyborg named Shrike is sent after them, motion captured by Stephen Lang, and he's not really essential to the plot. He's basically there for someone for them to run away from in the second act. But the character conceptually is really interesting because he's this former soldier in this robot body. He doesn't feel anything, he doesn't remember anything, supposedly, and he's really impervious, and yet there's definitely vestiges of humanity there. He definitely remembers something, especially because he's attracted to broken things. This movie has a lot of really on-the-nose things, like the fact that Hester's mother is named Pandora. Her box gets stolen by Valentine, Pandora's box. Yeah, real cute there. But nevertheless, there's a lot of really interesting things the movie kind of brings up with this, especially because Hester actually has some relationship with the character, but it's a bit of an unusual one. The movie doesn't really sell very well because, again, it's all being relayed through flashback, and that really works against the movie at the culmination of this subplot because it feels really unearned. Suddenly the movie pulls out this major emotional beat that just left me utterly perplexed. It was just so bewildering. Lang plays the character so well that he almost borders on perhaps being the most human person in the movie, and he's the killer robot character. But it's basically all trying to hurtle towards a climax which really doesn't make sense on a lot of levels. You've got this huge super weapon that supposedly devastated whole cities, and yet it has trouble blasting through a wall, or we've got a scene where someone takes the slowest amount of time to press the numbers that are being displayed on the monitor in front of them on a keyboard. How long does it take to enter a 6-digit combination? Apparently at least 30 seconds, according to this movie. And it just seems like the film started out in a very promising way, and eventually it just ends up losing that under the weight of more and more explosions. Mortal Engines is such a bonkers premise, but it could have worked if they leaned more into the metaphor and imagery of it, if they leaned a bit more into the knowingly silly side of it, and instead it's another dull Mad Max ripoff, and the world doesn't need any more of those. It feels like the kind of movie that should be sat on a shelf next to the likes of Waterworld or that Mark Hamill movie Slipstream, which this honestly reminded me of at certain points. It's hard to believe that the same people that made this made the Lord of the Rings films, and before you ask, no, I don't think Jackson would have saved this movie if he directed it. I don't think the problems with this movie are to do necessarily with the direction so much as just the script and taking on far more than they could really chew. And I will say this about the movie. It probably knows that it's not going to get sequels because at least it decides to be self-contained. Clearly someone has at least learned their lessons from other book series that failed to get past their first movie. Although I do have to ask, who at Universal decided to send the filmmakers a note saying, you know what this movie needed? A Minions joke?
Mortal Engines is an absolute grind. Although the premise is close to ridiculous, the film takes itself far too seriously, apparently missing the metaphorical and satirical nature of its world almost completely. The film just tries to succeed on pure scale alone, and while there is some impressive steampunk production design, especially on London, much of the movie is generally unappealing and uninvolving. This is especially the case with the characters, particularly Hera Hilmar's Hester Shaw, who is far too guarded and hostile for the audience to connect with until it's too late, and others are simply steampunks steamrolled by the demands of the plot, which tries to pack far too much story in its 130-minute running time, complete with some dubious dialogue. Although largely feeling like a toned-down Mad Max, it cannibalizes other films like The Terminator into a generic post-apocalyptic stew that feels like it has little identity of its own. And it's hard to believe this unlikely franchise starter comes from the same team that gave us the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
If you like this review, then you can ingest more at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.